Of the book of the Revelation. I hope that you have enjoyed our study of the Revelation through the videos or in the class. Today we are going to be in what I think is the most important part of the book. There are some people that hold that chapter 13 is the most important because it deals with the beast and the number of the beast or the mark of the beast, and people are all concerned about what that means and whether or not it's pertaining to today or something of that nature. There are others that hold that the most important chapter is chapters 20 and 21 that deal with the so-called 1,000-year reign of Christ. For me personally, I believe 17 and 18 are the most important parts of the book of the Revelation, because finally we get some indication of what the visions and the imagery is about. God reveals to us exactly what's going on, who it's pertaining to, and it's contained in these two chapters. Unlike Daniel, that he has the vision and then God immediately explains what that vision meant. Unfortunately for us, the Revelation letter is not like that. The Revelation letter is clouded in so much symbolism and figurative language. And unfortunately, we only have these two chapters that do any part of revealing for us who the beast is, how it's represented in the book. And so we're going to spend our time together here in chapters 17 and 18. Now you'll remember, I hope, from our last study, we finished with the 7 bowls of wrath. The nations that had been persecuting and spilling the blood of the Christians, they were warned through trumpets, 7 of them in fact. They ignored the warning, they refused to repent, so now God's wrath is poured out upon the earth through these 7 bowls of wrath. And the 7th bowl is poured into the air, and flashings of lightning, and you have peals of thunder and a giant earthquake that splits the city into different parts. And notice that these people are still blaspheming God. Another indication that this cannot be about the end of all time, because if this is the final battle, those who had previously blasphemed God would already be dealt with. They'd already be gone. But the fact of the matter is they still remain, and they still remain in defiance against the Lord God. So now we move into chapter 17, and finally the revelation is revealed for us. We see a contrast as we get into this section, a contrast between the woman that we read about in Revelation 12 and this woman that we're going to read about in chapter 17. The woman who was pregnant that the dragon was trying to keep from the birth happening, or to devour the son as he was getting born, that woman was seen as clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and there was a crown of 12 stars upon her. And we were told in chapter 12 that the dragon who's trying to devour the child is the devil, is Satan himself. And it says in the last part of chapter 12 that since he could not avenge or revenge himself with the woman, that he has taken his wrath out on the woman's seed, those who were bearing the persecution, those who were having their blood spilled as a result of their faithful witness to Christ. Now, unlike her in chapter 12, in this chapter we're going to meet a woman who is clothed in purple and scarlet. We're going to see her adorned with many precious jewels, and we're going to see her holding a gold cup that is filled with abominations. The background of chapters 17 and 18 is found in the Old Testament in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 51, which is a chapter devoted entirely to the destruction of literal Babylon back when they were the world dominant power of that day. You'll remember that in the bowls of wrath, we were told that the that Babylon was going down. They were going to be destroyed. Well, by this time, the nation that was known as Babylon back in Jeremiah's time was gone. They were no longer there. So Babylon here is representing the current nation who is in power, who is responsible for the blood of the saints. And that's what we're going to be reading as we explore the 17th chapter together. Let's take a look at the first 6 verses. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, Come here, and I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed sexual immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her sexual immorality. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. And then I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a cup, a gold cup full of abominations, and of the unclean things of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And then I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered greatly. So when we look at this text, we immediately know this vision. Who is it about? And it is about this great harlot, the one who sits on many waters, verse 1 says. That's what John is being seen here in this vision. The vision is about this great harlot. And notice how much influence that she has and who it is on. She has influences over the kings of the earth. Those who are willing to commit sexual immorality with her, whether that be physical or whether that be spiritual, nonetheless, they're getting drunk on the wine of her impurity or immorality, and they are loving it. They're welcoming it. And so that's who the vision is about. She is sitting, it says, on a scarlet beast, a red beast. And the beast has all kinds of blasphemous names written upon it. And he has 7 heads and 10 horns. We're going to get into the meaning of those horns and those heads in just a second, so hang on to that. But I want you to notice what is pictured here of her. She's dressed in scarlet. She's dressed in purple. She is adorned in beautiful jewels. And she has a cup full of abominations. Well, the immediate picture of her is this idea of purple and scarlet would signify royalty. Kings were the ones who wore purple robes. That's what kings wore, and they would be known for the power, the wealth they had, or the precious stones that would signify that kind of royalty. Well, the one who had the kingdom, the one who had the world power, the one who had all of the influence of the first century was the kingdom of Rome, the empire of Rome. And so what we're seeing here is that the king that we're talking about has to be Rome, and that's going to be identified in just a minute. But the kings of the earth are in the first century were those who were under the authority of the Roman Caesar of the day. And notice that it says that she is responsible for the spilling of the blood of the saints, the blood that she has slain of the witnesses of Jesus. So all through the entire Revelation letter, it has been about the persecution of the witnesses of Jesus, those who are called saints. Their blood has been spilled. They're the ones at the altar, or actually under the altar, pleading out to God and asking for Him to avenge their blood. She's the one responsible for that. Now that we've been given the vision, now we get the next part, which is the explanation. And it says in verse 7, "And the angel said to me, 'Why do you wander? I will tell you the mystery of the woman.'" Aren't we glad that there's finally somebody that says, "I'm going to tell you. Going to tell you what it is. The mystery of the woman, of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. So the beast you saw is not, but is about to come up out of the abyss. And he's going to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will wonder when they see the beast that he was, but is not, but will come. Now here's the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is, and the other has not yet come, but when he does, he's going to remain just a little while. And the beast which was and is not is himself an 8th. He is one of the 7, but he's the one that's going to destruction. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they do receive authority as kings with the beast for at least an hour. These have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. These are going to wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb is going to overcome them because he is the King of Kings and he is the Lord of Lords, and those who are with him are the ones who are called the elect and the faithful. And so he said to me, "The waters that you saw where the harlot sits, those are the peoples, the crowds, the nations, and the tongues. And the 10 horns that you saw and the beast, these will hate the harlot and will lay waste to her, make her naked, and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire. For God gave it in their hearts to do his purpose, both by doing their own common purpose and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be finished. And the woman whom you saw is the great city, which has a kingdom over the kings of the earth." Okay, there's a lot going on here, a lot of chaotic language, just reading it straight, but let's break it down, and I believe we're going to get an understanding. Notice that it says about the beast. The beast is the one that she's sitting on. This is the harlot. It says that he was, but is not. What does that mean? That means that he doesn't exist anymore, but he is coming back. And he's coming back towards his destruction. So you remember in chapter 13 of the Revelation, we were met with 2 beasts. One of the sea and one of the earth. Now, the one in the sea had already had a fatal wound and had died, remember? But we said that in that fatal wound was going to be healed. It wasn't a resurrection of the person. It was a resurrection of what the person responsible for the blood of the saints did. And so the beast of the sea seems to be the first persecution in history against the church. That was by Nero. And the second beast of the earth, the one who would resurrect the persecution against the Christians, was going to be Domitian. And we're going to find that the Bible testifies to that, because it's one thing to assume that's who it's talking about. It's a whole nother thing to actually use our scriptures and have that verify the meaning of the text. But what we see here is the beast has gone. It's not current. It's gone. But it will come back. And it's going to dwell on the earth. And it's going to go to his destruction. But all of those who are not found written in the book of life, they are going to see the beast that was and is not, but is going to come. Now it says the 7 heads. We get the meaning of the 7 heads. And the 7 heads actually have 2 representations here. Notice that the very first thing it says is it's the city on 7 mountains. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which she sits. Back in going ahead in verse 18, it says the woman is the great city, the one who has the authority of the kings of the earth. This is the reigning kingdom of the day. Well, Rome was one of the very first, I believe it is the first city to call itself the city on 7 hills. And in fact, that's still how it's known today. My understanding is that every year there is a commemoration of the fact that it is the city upon 7 hills. Now we have an identity. What he's talking about is the beast and the woman represents Rome. That's who it's about. That's the world power of the day. That would be who would be considered in that time the great city. That's who it's talking about. But there's a second meaning of the 7 heads, and the 7 heads are kings. Well, who were the kings under the great city in the first century? The first century city was Rome, so the kings have to be the Caesars. They have to be because they were the world power of that day. So if we understand that correctly, then all we need to do is consider the counting of those kings, and we will identify who it is that's the beast getting ready to come. Now, those of you who are a part of the Daniel study, you'll remember in Daniel chapter 7 that there were 10 horns. And the Bible in Daniel 7 suggested that they were all going to be kings of the 4th empire. Now, this is important because a lot of people misuse the visions of Daniel and they talk about it being all futuristic. And they leave out the fact that Daniel himself is told within which kingdom period that the visions relate to. In Daniel chapter 7, he's given a vision of 4 different beasts. And those 4 different beasts represents the 4 coming kingdoms, just as the dream of Nebuchadnezzar and the huge statue represented the 4 coming kingdoms, beginning with the gold head, which was Babylon itself. Okay? Bearing that in mind, when we get into chapter 7, when we get to that 4th beast, it's a terrifying beast. That's the one Daniel's most concerned about. And he says there are 10 horns and 3 will be uprooted by the 11th king, who is the one who will speak blasphemy and be responsible for the blood of the saints. Be careful with the passages of Daniel, because there are very few passages that relate to Rome or the 4th empire. Most of Daniel's prophecies relate to the time of the Persian Empire and the Grecian Empire, not so much Rome, but this particular one certainly does. So if that's what we understand, then here is the 5 who was, but they have fallen. And when we say they've fallen, we are to understand they're no more. They've died. So I've got a listing of the kings, and I've got the years that they reigned. So if we start with the first Caesar under the Roman Empire, that would be Caesar Augustus, who reigned for 41 years. We might be familiar with Caesar Augustus because it was during his reign where the decree was given that everybody had to go to their native homeland to be counted in the census. That's why Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and it was during the period that Augustus was Caesar. After him was Tiberius, who reigned for 23 years. Caligula for 4. He was actually a madman. Claudius reigned for 13 years. Claudius is also mentioned in the New Testament in the book of Acts, chapter 17, being responsible for casting out all of the Jews out of Rome. And finally, there was Nero, who reigned for 14 years, leading up to AD 68. That would be 2 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. So, if we count the kings correctly, the 5 who are fallen are those 5. Now, if you'll remember in Daniel, those who had the Daniel study, but for those who haven't, I suggest you read Daniel chapter 7. Man, actually, I suggest you read the whole book if you haven't read it in a while, or if you've never read it at all. But the next three horns are three different kings that never established a kingdom in full power. They were Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. Combined, they only reigned 1 year. There was not enough for their reign to really be established. So if we count them from Daniel, we go from 5 to 8. But remember, when the 11th horn would come, the boastful horn, he's going to uproot 3 kings. We know that Domitian was at least in some combat against Vitellius. Perhaps he was also involved in the other 2, but we know for sure Vitellius was one of those in whom Domitian fought against. Nonetheless, what John does is he omits those 3 kings. So if you take 8 and subtract 3, you still have 5 kings. 5 from Daniel, 5 from the Revelation, because those 3 kings are removed, okay? So if you can kind of follow along, counting the horns in Daniel, we have 8 with 3 of them uprooted. In the Revelation, we have only had 5. Now we have 1 is. When you read 1 is, that signifies that's current. That's what's going on now. Well, the very next person who was Caesar was Vespasian, and he reigned for a period of 10 years. Okay, and it was during his reign that the destruction of Jerusalem happened in AD 70. It was not Vespasian that did it, but it was his son Titus, who came after him as Caesar, who actually did it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why the destruction of Jerusalem, which is a common thought among even our brotherhood, that's what's believed the Revelation is about. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. But I want you to consider that Vespasian is the one who is, if we count the kings correctly. And that would also help us indicate it was sometime during 68 to 78 AD that John is writing the Revelation letter. Not AD 90 like a lot of scholars suggest, but it had to be during this period if the counting of the kings is correct, because he says Vespasian is the one who is. Now notice that the next one, the other one, has not yet come, and when he does, he will remain for just a little bit, a short time. Titus was one of 2 years. In fact, he was the shortest reigning Caesar in the entire empire of that first century. So, one has not yet come. He's going to remain for just a little while. Titus was the 7th king. There's your 7. And you have the 5 who are no more. You have the 1 who is, and you have the 1 who is to come. That equals 7. The interesting thing about Vespasian and Titus, 2 of them, there's 2 things. Number 1 is they never ever demanded emperor worship. That was first done by Domitian, who was a second son of Vespasian. Second thing is, these 2 never were hostile against the church. Never in their reign was there any kind of persecution against the church. So that leads us to the 8th king, who's one of the 7. In other words, he's one of the Caesars, plus he's the 11th horn in Daniel, the one who's uprooting the 3, and he is going to be the blasphemous king who is responsible for the spilling of the blood, and that is Domitian. Now, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem theory, what happens is most of those that believe this is about that. You have to go back and start with Julius Caesar. And the problem with that is Julius Caesar was not an emperor or a Caesar during the period of the Roman Empire. In fact, the great historian, the Roman historian Tacitus, also calls Augustus the first emperor. But just for the logic, if you count the kings starting with Julius Caesar, the first 5 who are no more takes us to Claudius. That would mean the one who has to be Nero. You omit the next 3, go to Vespasian, who is supposed to have the short reign, leading up to the one who's the beast, and that's how they identify Titus, the one responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem, as the beast of the Revelation. The problem with that is so many. First of all, as I just said, Julius Caesar's not ever numbered as one of the Caesars in the Roman Empire, because the empire was not yet established yet. Second thing, was not ever very good at math, but I will tell you, when you have a 10-year reign by Vespasian followed by a 2-year reign by his son Titus, it doesn't take a genius at math to realize that the short reign was not Vespasian. We might say, and I've heard this suggested, well, 10 years isn't all that long. Well, my goodness, we think if a president we didn't vote for or we don't like reigns for 8 years, 2 terms, how long did those 8 years last? See, 10 years is a long time, especially with a poor leader in charge. Nonetheless, the math just doesn't work. And the other thing is, the entire Revelation letter has not been about persecution of the Jews. The Jews are the ones who rejected Jesus. They're holding on to the sacrificial system. This is a telling about persecution against those who are the witnesses for Jesus Christ. These are the Christians. These aren't the Jews. And the other thing is, yes, Titus was responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem. However, it wasn't during his reign. It was during the reign of Vespasian. So how could he be the beast, the one who is to come, if what he already did was under the reign of his father? See, the math, the logic just does not work to support this idea. That's why history playing out as it does and pertaining to the 7 churches that John is writing to, the only thing that makes the most sense historically is the 2 responsible for the persecutions against the church. Nero being the first one, Domitian the second one. So now we have, and I've heard this, but somebody will say, there is no historic evidence that Domitian ever persecuted the church. He persecuted his own people. He was certainly insane. He certainly was one of those that demanded emperor worship, but there's nothing that says that he actually persecuted the church. Well, that is absolutely not so. No, it's not recorded in a lot of secular histories, because the fact of the matter is Christians were not important enough to be categorized as inclusive in Roman history. But the fact of the matter is, there is 2 writings that do suggest that Domitian did actually do persecution against the church. Eusebius is considered to be the most noted church historian of the day, and he wrote a whole history of the church. Tertullian actually comes way back before, around the 1st century, and it's believed he was one of the apostles of John. But Eusebius is quoted as saying, he, meaning Domitian, was the second to organize a persecution against us, the us meaning us Christians. We have a quote from Tertullian talking about Domitian. A Nero in cruelty, Domitian had once tried to do the same as Nero, but quickly stopped. And he says, I suppose it's because maybe he had some sense. Those are quotations that directly speak about Domitian's persecution of the Christians. What I've heard from people that still want to hold on to the doctrine that this is about the destruction of Jerusalem is they dismiss those writings entirely, saying they're inaccurate because they don't agree with secular history. But again, you can't ignore that from a Christian perspective, that there were writings that actually stated there was. Polycarp, as I've mentioned before, was also a disciple of John's. He was from the church of Smyrna, one of the 7 churches, and it happened later. It didn't happen during Domitian's period of time, but he also faced another persecution in which his own life he gave up because he would not deny Christ. Christians in the first century called Domitian the bloody arm of Nero. And so you do have evidence that everything that John's talking about here that coincides with the visions that Daniel was given about the 11th horn, the blasphemous little horn that God was going to go to war against, it is immediately identified with Domitian. I was not raised with this idea. I was never taught this idea until much later in my life. But I will tell you, understanding this premise from a historical background that verifies exactly what we're talking about has left me with a whole lot less questions about the Revelation letter. Do I have everything correct in the whole Revelation letter? I would assure you I probably don't. But my whole purpose of doing the Revelation study for you has not been to convince you of everything that I believe about the Revelation. It's been to give you something to think about, that something that seems to make the best sense from my judgment. But you have to weigh it for yourself. You need to study the book of Revelation and consider for yourself what according to how history played out in the first century and staying in the relevance of the context of the book, what makes the best sense for you? And that's why I've presented to you to the best of my ability what I think makes the most sense. Okay, so let's move on. Actually, I want to go back just a bit because I want to talk about Domitian's reign. He reigned from 81 to 96, about 15 years as Caesar. He is suspected of actually killing his brother Titus. It was never verified, but he was always suspected of doing so. He did fight against Vitellius. There's your uprooting of at least one of the 3 horns that Daniel talked about. He was the first emperor to deify himself and demand emperor worship. You can immediately understand why Christians would really struggle with that. He led a persecution and even death, announced death sentences to anybody who did not honor his deity, and that would, of course, include Christians. And the persecution seems to have taken place towards the end of his reign, and I don't know if it was because, as Tertullian said, maybe he got some sense towards the end, maybe all of the natural disasters that God's talking about caused him to think twice. I don't know, but I do know shortly after, evidently close to the end of his reign, he was assassinated, and that may also have played a factor in the stopping of the persecution of the church. So, moving on, we have 10 horns. It says that these 10 horns, they have a kingdom, but they don't have any kind of authority. The only authority they have as kings was given to them by the beast. Well, back in that time, it was not uncommon to have leaders or kings who were in different parts of the world, but they were still under the authority of Caesar. You might remember King Herod, for instance. What kingdom did he reign? Well, people will say, well, he reigned in Jerusalem. Well, yeah, he did, but the only power he was given was that of Caesar's. He was answerable to the reigning Caesar of Rome. It wasn't his authority, he was under theirs. And so the 10 kings seem to be those who have some authority given to them, but their authority does not supersede that of the beast. And in verse 16, it says these 10 horns, they hated her, but evidently not enough to do anything to her or oppose her. It wasn't until his death that they actually it says that they eat her flesh, and I think that's all symbolic. They burn her up with fire, make her naked. They exposed her is what they did, and they didn't do it until after he was dead. But for the common purpose, it was their purpose to unite together, and their purpose was expressed in verse 13. They were given power and authority to the beast. Why? To wage war against the Lamb. That Lamb is Christ. And the Lamb will overcome him. Why? Because he's the King of kings. He is the Lord of lords. And it says those who are with him are the elect. And they are the faithful. They are the Christians who are sharing in the victory that Christ Jesus is given. Chapter 17 helps our understanding in what the Revelation letter is all about. But there's further explanation that's revealed to us in chapter 18. Take a look. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illumined with his glory. He cried out with a mighty voice, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, and she has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit, a prison of every unclean bird, and a prison of every unclean and hateful beast. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the power of her sensuality. And then another voice from heaven said, Come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive of her plagues, for her sins have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back, even as she paid, and give her back double according to her deeds. In the cup that she has mix double for her. To the degree that she glorified herself and lived sensuously, to the same degree give her torment and mourning, for she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, and I'm not a widow, and I will never mourn. And for this reason, one day her plagues will come, pestilence and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire, for the Lord God who judges her is strong. So who loses? The harlot, the great city, the one who is leading people into sexual immorality. She loses. And the voice that cries, Fallen, fallen is great, Babylon the Great, that indicates their doom has come. That didn't mean that Rome still didn't have power. They still continued to be the empire of the day. But at least as far as this beast is concerned, or Domitian is concerned, his power's done. He's been dealt with. And so the reign of the king has come to a conclusion. But notice that it says that all of the nations who have drunk her wine, there's that cup imagery of judgment, has been poured out. It's been put upon the kings of the earth, all of those who were engaged in sexual immorality. But there's a voice that says in verse 4, Come out of her, my people. In other words, it relates to some of the church, because you remember, the church was situated in societies who were devoted to the loyalties of Caesar. Maybe some of those in the church of those 7 were part of that. And they were also, because we know for a fact that some of them had already engaged in some sexual immoral acts, such as Pergamum and Thyatira, in fact. So he is saying, come out of her so that you don't participate in her sins and receive her punishment too. Remember, God told a couple of the churches that's exactly what they would receive if they did not repent. But those who are faithful are the ones saying, pay her back double for what she's paid to us. For the spilling of our blood, pay back to her double. And it says that in one day her plagues will come and she will be burned up with fire. We'll finish up here in this next section, starting with verse 9. And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived sensuously with her will cry and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance because of the fear of her torment, saying, Woe, woe, the great city Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth cry and mourn over her because no one buys their cargo anymore, cargo of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls and fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet and every kind of citron wood and every article of ivory, every article made from precious wood, bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, amomum, and incense and perfume and frankincense and wine and olive oil. You get the picture how much they relied on Rome? Flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, cargo, and even human beings and human lives. As the fruit you long for has gone from you, and all things that were splendid and shining have passed away from you, and men will no longer find them. And it says, we'll stop there, in fact. Notice who's grieving over her. It says the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality with her, they're the ones crying. Now, I have a question to ask for those who still hold on to this idea that the Revelation letter is about the end of all time. Because if that's true, tell me how come at the conclusion of the whole judgments of wrath, the bowls of wrath have been poured out, Babylon has fallen. Tell me how come anybody is concerned about all the articles of gold and silver and stones and purple and everything else that they were purchasing from Rome if this is the final battle of all time. See, this is painting a picture for us that's similar to passages like out of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, where it says that God is going to come in and he's going to take away all of the access of the things that the nation of Israel has been trading for and been relying on other nations for. He's going to take all those away, and the ones who will be left in mourning are the ones who are grieving because they don't have the privilege of getting those things anymore. I think his warning is very valid for us. Come out of her, my people, so that you don't participate in her sins. Do you think that we live in a time where society continually threatens our faith? Do you think that we live in a time where everything that we do, everything we see on television, every book we read, all the music we listen to, do you not think that there are situations that are ungodly that threaten who we are as people of God? Yeah, absolutely. Case in point. About 20 years ago, while I was still calling the radio announcing for the Tri-City Storm hockey team out of Kearney, Nebraska, we were on a trip to St. Louis to play the Heartland Eagles for a weekend. And on our way there, we were traveling down on bus down I-70 between Kansas City and St. Louis. And Coach made mention about Missouri being one of those who's kind of like the Bible Belt of the nation. You know, a lot of church belief in the area of the Midwest, and especially through the state of Missouri. And yet, sign after sign after sign, all the way down the stretch of highway I-70, everything you saw was about the nearest adult video store or adult store that was coming up on the nearest exit, all the way down. Do we live in a time where sexual immorality exists? You bet we do. Do you not think that Christians that attend church here every week, do you not think that Christians struggle with pornography? Do you not think that Christians struggle with greed? Do you not think that Christians struggle with arrogance and pride? Do you not think that Christians struggle with all kinds of things that replace God as our focal point? Yes, we certainly do. And the shame of it is that we never consider the fact that when we're watching a television program that shows us images that we know are biblically wrong, or we're watching a movie, or we're listening to music that might use all kinds of four-letter words and just it would not be something you would be listening to if Jesus were sitting next to you. I heard it said one time that we who are participating in those things are becoming spiritually raped, and we're purposely allowing it to happen. The message is valid, folks. Come out of her, my people, so that you do not participate in her sins and receive her plagues. There is so much better to the life we have in Christ instead of a life and practice of sin. Don't let sin cause you to lose your standing with God. Don't let sin cause you to be on the losing side, because you'll regret it for eternity if you do. The victory is in Jesus. Are you right with him? And I hope you are. We'll finish up chapter 18 when we get together next time, and then we'll look at the